Welcome back, everyone. Get ready to dive into some seriously fascinating stuff. We're talking faith, reason, and the wild world of our own minds. And the best part is our sources are all over the place. We've got Alvin Plantinga, the Augustinian Christian philosophy guy. Heavy stuff, but so insightful.
Oh, definitely a heavyweight in the philosophy world. His ideas really challenge the way we think about knowledge and belief.
Right, and to make things even more interesting, we're also looking at this PDF called Connecting the Dots. It's all about how our modern world shapes the way we think. Often not for the better, they argue.
It's a thought-provoking piece, for sure.
Yeah.
It pushes back on some of the assumptions we often take for granted in today's culture.
Exactly. And to round things out, we'll be hearing from a neuroscientist, Dr. Anne McGilchrist, who says our brains are practically wired for division. Then we'll top it all off with a dash of Pope Benedict XVI on, you guess it, faith and reason.
Quite the lineup. It's amazing how these sources, although they might seem unrelated at first glance, all grapple with this fundamental question of how we know what we know.
Totally. It's like they're each shining a light on different facets of the same big puzzle, the puzzle of truth, knowledge, and how we make sense of it all. But before we get ahead of ourselves, let's start with Plantinga. He doesn't want us to just accept the popular opinions out there, especially when it comes to big questions of truth.
He's all about digging deeper, challenging assumptions. And he really takes aim at these two ideas he calls idols, perennial naturalism, and creative anti-realism.
Yeah, those are kind of intimidating terms.
They sound complex, but they're actually pretty straightforward once you break them down.
Okay, so break them down for me.
Okay, imagine someone who's completely devoted to what they can see and touch, to the point that they believe love is just chemicals in the brain.
So they think everything can be explained by science.
That's the core of perennial naturalism. It insists that the material world is all that exists. Plantinga argues that this perspective is far too limiting, that it misses a whole dimension of reality.
It's like they're only seeing half the picture, right?
No, exactly. And then you have creative anti-realism, which is almost the opposite. It's this idea that we humans create meaning, or at least we decide what's true for us.
It's like everyone has their own truth.
Yeah, Plantinga calls it silly foolishness, but it's a surprisingly common way of thinking these days.
Oh, absolutely. But doesn't that make it nearly impossible to have real conversations, to solve problems together, if everyone has their own truth?
That's precisely what this Connecting the Dots PDF digs into. The author is really concerned that we're losing sight of objective truth, this idea that some things are just plain true regardless of how we feel about them.
And they say that's a problem.
The PDF argues it leads to a lot of issues, like relativism, where all opinions are seen as equally valid,
Yeah.
and emotivism, this idea that our feelings should dictate our moral choices.
Which can become a slippery slope.
Definitely. The PDF even uses identity politics as an example.
Okay, how does that fit in?
Well, they're not saying individual identity isn't important. It clearly is. But they argue that becoming overly focused on our differences can make it harder to find common ground, to search for truth together.
So finding that balance is key. Interesting.
Right, and this whole decline in shared truth, according to the PDF, is connected to another bold claim they make. The only real knowledge is scientific knowledge.
Whoa. I mean, I can see why people might say that, especially in our tech-obsessed world. But is science really the only way to know something? What about intuition, personal experiences? Those have to count for something.
You're hitting on exactly what Plantinga wants us to consider. He says claiming that science is the only source of knowledge is kind of like saying a hammer is the only tool that matters. It's great for nails, but what about saws, screwdrivers, or even a good old-fashioned wrench? He reminds us there are many paths to knowledge.
Okay, I like that analogy. Makes sense.
Right. He emphasizes things like self-awareness, our ability to learn from what we see and hear, and even the importance of trusting reliable sources. We use these everyday ways of knowing all the time.
He uses this example of knowing something because you clearly remember learning it from someone you trust. Like it's not a scientific fact, but you just know it to be true because of how you learned it.
That's exactly the kind of knowledge Plantinga wants to validate. It made me realize we gain knowledge in ways we don't even think about. It doesn't always come from a textbook or a lab.
So it's more about the why behind what we believe.
Right, and that's where he introduces this idea of warrant, which is such a powerful concept.
Warrant. Okay, now you have to explain that one.
Basically, it's about having a good reason for believing something that elevates a hunch into actual knowledge. You might believe something really strongly, but if it's based on, like, flimsy evidence or just a gut feeling, Plantinga wouldn't call that knowledge.
So you can think your favorite sports team is the best, but without any stats to back it up, it's not really knowledge, right?
Perfect example. You can believe it all you want, but without that warrant, that solid justification, it's more like wishful thinking. And what's cool about Plantinga is he argues that we get this warrant from all sorts of places. Our senses, memories, interactions with others, and even, he'd say, from God.
Okay, that's pretty profound when you think about it.
Right. This idea of warrant makes knowledge accessible to everyone, not just scientists or academics.
It's like saying, hey, we've all got what it takes to understand the world.
And that leads perfectly into our next source, the interview with Ian McGilchrist, because his work on the brain shows us how the way we pay attention dramatically shapes what we know and what we come to believe.
So let's talk about this whole attention thing.
Yeah.
Who is this Dr. McGilchrist, and what does he mean when he says our brains are wired for division?
Well, McGilchrist, he's a psychiatrist, actually, and he's done some groundbreaking work on the differences between the two hemispheres of the brain. But it's not as simple as, like, the left brain controls logic and the right brain is for creativity, though he'd agree those things are true.
There's more to it.
He says it's all about how each half of the brain pays attention to the world, how it perceives things.
Okay, so give me an example. How would, say, the left hemisphere experience something like, I don't know, walking through a forest?
Okay, picture this. Someone walking through a forest, laser focused on identifying every single plant, analyzing the soil composition, super detail oriented. That's your left hemisphere in action.
So very precise, very analytical.
Exactly. And for the right hemisphere, imagine the other person on that walk. They're soaking in the experience as a whole. The dappled sunlight, the feeling of the breeze, the sound of birds in the distance. They're in awe of the forest as this whole interconnected, living thing.
Wow, what a difference. It's like one person is dissecting the forest and the other's experiencing its magic.
That's a great way to put it. McGilchrist would say the left hemisphere is amazing at breaking things down, categorizing, analyzing. It's the king of logic, linear thinking, which we need for tasks that require that focus.
But if we're always in that analytical mode, do we miss out on the bigger picture?
That's exactly his point. We need that right hemisphere to grasp the nuances, the connections, the things you can't really define or measure. It's the source of our creativity, our empathy, our ability to find meaning in something beyond, like the purely practical.
And McGilchrist says that Western society, we're out of balance, too focused on this left brain thinking.
He actually calls it a form of right hemisphere brain damage, and he sees evidence of it everywhere.
Like where?
Well, take our emphasis on, say, reductionist science, breaking everything down to its smallest parts but often losing sight of the whole, or the sense of meaninglessness that so many people feel today. McGilchrist would say that's a symptom of a world that's neglecting the right hemisphere's way of making sense of things.
So it's like we're so busy analyzing the individual brushstrokes, we forget to appreciate the beauty of the whole painting.
Perfect analogy. And McGilchrist argues that this over-reliance on the left hemisphere, it's not just an individual problem, it's cultural too. It feeds into this hyper-rational, often humorless approach to life.
It's funny you say that because it makes me think of that point in Connecting the Dots about community and tradition being in decline. Do you think that's part of this whole left brain takeover too?
Oh, I think McGilchrist would say absolutely. Those things, community, tradition, a sense of belonging, those are inherently right brain ways of connecting, of finding meaning. When they disappear, we lose that vital counterbalance to the left hemisphere's dominance. It's like that saying.
It takes a village.
Yes. Exactly. And in the interview, McGilchrist even talks about this whole victimhood culture thing, this tendency to focus on who's been wronged the most. He suggests that even that comes from the left hemisphere's obsession with power and control.
Really? So instead of seeing ourselves as part of this web of relationships with rights and responsibilities, we get stuck in this cycle of blame and resentment.
Yes, because the left hemisphere, it needs to feel in control. And to do that, it's constantly scanning for injustice, for threats. It gets so caught up in that it often misses the bigger picture. Our shared humanity, the importance of taking responsibility for ourselves.
So it sounds like we're in a bit of a predicament. If, like McGilchrist says, we're all walking around with this right hemisphere brain damage, is there any hope? How do we fix it?
Well, McGilchrist doesn't pretend to have all the answers, but he does offer some guidance. He says we need to actively nurture the values and the ways of being that the right hemisphere champions. Things like empathy, compassion, a sense of connection to something bigger than ourselves, even humor.
It's like we need to relearn how to just be in the world, to slow down, appreciate beauty, connect with each other. In our go-go-go world, how do we even make time for that?
That's the challenge, isn't it? It takes a conscious effort. We have to start questioning this assumption that faster and more efficient is always better.
Hmm.
We need to create space for reflection, for those activities that nourish the right hemisphere, spending time in nature, listening to music, losing ourselves in a good book.
It reminds me of that saying, stop and smell the roses. And I love how you brought that back to McGilchrist's idea of the right brain. It's not just about literally smelling the roses. It's about engaging that sense of wonder and appreciation for the beauty that's all around us.
Exactly. And honestly, in a world that often feels so chaotic and divided, consciously cultivating those right hemisphere qualities, empathy, connection, a sense of awe, it might be more important now than ever.
Okay, so we've talked about how our modern world shapes our thinking, and even how our own brains might be working against us a little. But where does Pope Benedict the Sixth fit into all of this? His lecture feels like a whole different ballgame.
It does feel like a bit of a shift, yeah, but it's surprisingly relevant to everything we've been discussing. Benedict dives into this long-standing debate about faith and reason, but he does it in a way that speaks directly to the challenges we face today. He even uses this fascinating story, this dialogue between a Byzantine emperor, Manuel II Paleologus, and a scholar from Persia back in the 14th century.
Okay, I'm intrigued. What were they debating?
Well, they were discussing religion, and the emperor, he was drawing on ancient Greek philosophy, and he was pushing back against this idea of spreading faith by force. He argued that it's just not reasonable.
Sounds like the emperor was a pretty forward-thinking guy for the 14th century.
Right, and Benedict uses this exchange to highlight how Christianity and Islam have viewed this whole faith and reason thing differently throughout history. The emperor, coming from that Greek philosophical tradition, he saw reason as this fundamental part of God's nature. But the Persian scholar, he represented this more absolute view of God, where God's will isn't limited by human ideas like reason.
So where does Christianity land on that spectrum? Is there room for both faith and reason?
That's exactly what Benedict explores. He argues that from its very beginning, Christianity has embraced both. He even points to how God reveals himself to Moses in the burning bush. Remember, I am.
Right.
It's not just a name, it's this powerful statement of existence, a challenge to the kind of mythical thinking that was common back then.
It's like God saying, hey, I'm not just another god in a pantheon. I am existence itself.
Exactly. And Benedict would say that the God of the Bible, he's the foundation of all reality, the ultimate source of truth and reason. And that understanding, it has huge implications for how we see ourselves, the world, even our purpose in it.
This is really making me rethink some things. But I remember reading about this idea of de-Hellenization in Benedict's lecture. What's that all about?
Yes. Dehellenization. It's this idea of removing the Greek philosophical influence on Christianity, basically saying, let's go back to the pure message of Jesus without all the philosophical baggage.
So kind of like trying to make Christianity fit into a purely left-brained worldview, stripping away all the nuance and complexity.
That's a brilliant connection. And that's precisely what Benedict was concerned about. He saw dehellenization as this well-intentioned but ultimately misguided attempt to make Christianity more palatable to the modern mind. And he worried that in doing so, we risk losing something essential. He actually argues that faith can enhance our capacity for reason. It can open our minds to a wider range of understanding.
So it's not about choosing sides, faith, or reason. It's about recognizing how they can work together.
Exactly. Benedict actually calls for what he calls a broad reason, a way of thinking that's open to the fullness of reality, not just the stuff we can measure in a lab. It's about acknowledging the validity of insights gained through faith, through experience, through intuition.
This has been such a thought-provoking conversation. It feels like we've come full circle. We started by questioning our assumptions about knowledge.
Yeah, and then we dove into how our very brains shape how we perceive the world.
And now Benedict is challenging us to approach it all with this broad reason, recognizing the value of both faith and reason. What an amazing journey.
It really has been. So where does this leave us? What do we take away from all of this?
Well, I think Plantinga would tell us to always examine the why behind what we believe. Look for that warrant. And the authors of Connecting the Dots, they remind us about the importance of shared truth, of finding common ground even when we disagree.
And of course, McGilchrist, he shows us just how powerful and how limited our own brains can be. He reminds us that we have a choice in how we pay attention to the world.
It's not easy, but we can choose to cultivate the qualities of that right hemisphere. Empathy, compassion, a sense of wonder.
So it sounds like the key is balance, embracing the fullness of who we are, both as individuals and as part of something much larger than ourselves.
I love that. It's about holding these seemingly opposite ideas in our minds at the same time. Faith and reason, logic and intuition, the individual and the community. It's in that tension, that beautiful complexity, that we discover what it truly means to be human. That's a beautiful note to end on. Thank you so much for joining me on this incredible deep dive, everyone. It's been a privilege to explore these ideas with you. Until next time.